right, chapter 108, The Exhumation. The night was fine, frosty, and bright, with the luster of a lovely moon. Even the chimneys and gables of the squalid houses of Globetown appeared to bathe their heads in that flood of silver light. The Resurrection Man and the Buffer pursued their way towards the cemetery. For some minutes they preserved a profound silence. At length the Buffer exclaimed, "I only hope, Tony, that this business won't turn out as bad as the job with young Markham 3 nights ago." "Why should it?" demanded the Resurrection Man in a gruff tone. "Well, I don't know why," answered the Buffer. "Perhaps, after all, it was just as well that feller escaped as he did. We might have swung for it." "Escape," muttered the Resurrection Man, grinding his teeth. "Yes, he did escape them, but I haven't done with him yet. He shall not get off so easy another time." "I wonder who those chaps was that come up so sudden," observed the Buffer after a pause. "Friends of his, no doubt," answered Tidkins. "Most likely he suspected a trap, or thought he would be on the right side. But the night was too plaguey dark, and the whole thing was too sudden. It was impossible to form an idea of who the strangers might be." "We know who they are." "One of them was precious strong, I know," said the Buffer. "But for my part, I think you'd better leave the young feller alone in the future. It's no good standing the chance of getting scragged for mere vengeance. I can't understand that sort of thing. If you like to crack his crib for him and hide the swag, I'm your man. But I'll have no more of a business that's all danger and no profit." Well, as you like," said the Resurrection Man impatiently. "Here we are, so look alive." They were now under the wall of the cemetery. The Buffer clambered to the top of the wall, which was not very high, and the Resurrection Man handed him the implements and tools, which he dropped cautiously upon the ground inside the enclosure. He then helped his companion upon the wall, and in another moment they stood together within the cemetery. "Are you sure we can find the way to the right grave?" demanded the Buffer in a whisper. "Don't be afraid," was the reply. "I could go straight up to it blindfold." They then shouldered their implements, and the Resurrection Man led the way to the spot where Mrs. Smith's anonymous lodger was buried. "I'm afeard the ground's precious hard," observed the Buffer, when he and his companion had satisfied themselves by a cautious glance around that no one was watching their movements. The eyes of these men had become so habituated to the obscurity of night, in consequence of the frequency with which they pursued their avocations during the darkness which cradled others to rest, that they were possessed of the visual acuteness generally ascribed to the cat. "We'll soon turn it up, let it be as hard as it will," said the Resurrection Man in answer to his comrade's remark. Then, suiting the action to the word, he began his operations in the following manner. He measured a distance of 5 paces from the head of the grave. At the point thus marked, he took a long iron rod and drove it in an oblique direction through the ground towards one end of the coffin. So accurate were his calculations relative to the precise spot in the coffin, the precise spot in which the coffin was embedded in the earth, that the iron rod struck against it the very first time he thus sounded the soil. "All right," he whispered to the Buffer. He then took a spade and began to break up the earth just at that spot where the end of the iron rod peeped out of the ground. "Not so hard as you thought," he observed. "The fact is, the whole burial place is so mixed up with human remains that the clay is too greasy to freeze very easy." "I suppose that's it," said the Buffer. The Resurrection Man worked for about 10 minutes with a skill and an effect that would have astonished even Jones the gravedigger himself, had he been there to see. He then resigned the spade to the Buffer, who took his turn with equal ardor and ability. With his 10 minutes elapsed, the Resurrectionists regaled themselves each with a dram from Tidkins' flask, and this individual then applied himself once more to the work at hand. When he was wearied, the Buffer relieved him, and thus did they fairly divide the toil until the excavation of the ground was complete. This portion of the task was finished in about 40 minutes. An oblique channel about 10 feet long and 3 feet square at the mouth, and decreasing only in length as it verged toward the head of the coffin at the bottom, was now formed. The Resurrection Man provided himself with a stout chisel, the handle of which was covered with leather, and with a mallet, the ends of which were also protected with pieces of the same material. Thus the former instrument, when struck by the latter, emitted but little noise. He then descended into the channel which terminated at the head of the coffin. Breaking away the soil that lay upon that end of the coffin, he inserted the chisel into the joints of the wood, and in a very few moments knocked off the board that closed the coffin at that extremity. The woodwork of the head of the shell was also removed with ease, for Banks had purposely nailed these parts of the 2 cases very slightly together. The Resurrection Man next handed up the tools to his companion, who threw him down a strong cord. The ends of this rope was then fastened under the armpit of the corpse as it lay in its coffin. This being done, the Buffer helped the Resurrection Man out of the hole. "So far, so good," said Tidkins. "It must be close upon 1 o'clock. We have got a quarter of an hour left, and that's plenty of time to do all that's yet to be done." The two men then took the rope between them and drew the corpse gently out of its coffin up the slope of the channel and landed it safely on the ground at a little distance from the mouth of the excavation. The moon fell upon the pale features of the dead, those features which were still unchanged, save in color, as if they had never come in contact with a shroud, nor belonged to a body that had been laid swathed in a winding sheet. The contrast formed by the white figure and the black soil on which it was stretched would have struck terror to the heart of anyone save a resurrectionist. Indeed, the moment the corpse was thus dragged forth from its grave, the Resurrection Man thrust his hand into its breast and felt for the gold. It was there, wrapped up, as the undertaker had described. "The blunt is all safe, Jack," said the Resurrection Man, and he secured the coin about his person. They then applied themselves vigorously to shovel back the earth, but when they had filled up the excavation, a considerable quantity of the soil still remained to dispose of, it being impossible, in spite of stamping down, to condense the earth into the same shape from which it was originally taken. They therefore filled 2 sacks with the surplus soil and proceeded to empty them in different parts of the ground. Their task was so far accomplished when they heard the low rumble of wheels in the lane outside the cemetery. To bundle the corpse neck and heels into a sack and gather their implements was the work of only a few moments. They then conveyed their burdens between them to the wall overlooking the lane, where the well-known voice of Mr. Banks greeted their ears as he stood upright in his cart, peering over the barrier into the cemetery. "Got the blessed defunct?" said the undertaker interrogatively. "Right and tight," answered the Buffer, "and the tin, too. Now then, look sharp. Here's the tools." "I got 'em," returned Banks. "Look out for the stiffin, then," added the Buffer, and, aided by the Resurrection Man, he shoved the body up to the undertaker, who deposited it in the bottom of his cart. The Resurrection Man and the Buffer then mounted the wall and got into the vehicle, in which they laid themselves down so that any person whom they might meet in the streets through which they were to pass would see only one individual in the cart, namely the driver. Otherwise, the appearance of 3 men at that time of night, or rather at that hour in the morning, might have excited suspicion. Banks lashed the sides of his horse, and the animal started offset at a round pace. Not a word was spoken during the short drive to the surgeon's residence in the Cambridge Road. When they reached his house, the road was quiet and deserted. A light glimmered through the fanlight over the door, and the door itself was opened the moment the cart stopped. The Resurrection Man and the Buffer sprang, and seeing that the coast was clear, bundled the corpse out of the vehicle in an instant. Then, in less than half a minute, the blessed defunct, as the undertaker called it, was safely lodged in the passage of the surgeon's house. Mr. Banks, as soon as the body was removed from his vehicle, drove rapidly away. His portion of the night's work was done, and he knew that his accomplices would give him his regulars when they should meet again. The Resurrection Man and the Buffer conveyed the body into the species of outhouse which the surgeon, who was passionately attached to anatomical studies, devoted to purposes of dissection and physiological experiment. In the middle of this room, which was about 10 feet long and 6 broad, stood a strong table, forming a slightly inclined plane. The stone pavement of the outhouse was perforated with holes in the immediate vicinity of the table, so that the fluid which poured from subjects for dissection might escape into a drain communicating with the common sewer. To the ceiling, immediately above the head of the table, was attached a pulley with a strong cord, by means of which a body might be supported in any position that was most convenient to the anatomist. The Resurrection Man and his companion carried the corpse into this dissecting room and placed it upon the table, the surgeon holding a candle to light their movements. "Now, Jack," said Tidkins to the Buffer, Do you take the stiffin out of the stack and lay him along decently on the table, ready for business, while I retire a moment to this gentleman's study and settle accounts with him." "Well and good," returned the Buffer. "I'll stay here till you come back." The surgeon lighted another candle, which he placed on the window-sill, and then withdrew, accompanied by the Resurrection Man. The Buffer shut the door of the dissecting room because the draught caused the candle to flicker and menaced the light with extinction. He then proceeded to obey the directions which he had received from his accomplice. The Buffer removed the sack from the body, which he then stretched out at a length upon the inclined table, taking care to place its head on the higher extremity and immediately beneath the pulley. "There, old feller," he said, "you're comfortable. At any rate, what a blessing it would be to your friends if they was ever to find out that you'd been had up again, to know into what skillful hands you'd happened to fall. Yeah, that'd be a real comfort. Thanks, Buffer. Thus musing, the Buffer turned his back listlessly toward the corpse and leaned against the table on which it was lying. Let me see, he said to himself. There's 31 pounds that was buried along with him, and then there's 10 pounds that the Sawbones is paying now to Tony for the match. That makes 41 pounds, and there's 3 to go shares. What does that make? 3 goes into 4 once, 3's into 11, goes 3 and 2 over. That's 13 pounds apiece, and 2 pounds to split. The Buffer started abruptly around and became deadly pale. He thought he heard a slight movement of the corpse, and his whole frame trembled. I'm just thinking, oh my gosh, what's actually happening? Almost at the same moment, some object was hurled violently against the window. The glass was shattered to atoms. The candle was thrown down and extinguished, and total darkness reigned in the dissecting room. "Hullo," cried the Buffer, turning sick at heart. "What's that?" Scarcely had these words escaped his lips when he felt his hand suddenly grasp the cold fingers of the corpse, and he fell insensible across the body on the table. It's the end of that chapter. I have no idea what just happened. Someone broke the window. Someone broke the window, and the Buffer, panicked and passed out, I guess. Okay, we'll see what happens in the next chapter.